This is episode 652 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I'm very pleased to be joined this week by Germaine Chappelle. She is an attorney and was involved with the Energy Transition Act way back when in 2019, and she is still involved in issues surrounding the Energy Transition Act. Welcome to, or back to Tipping Point, New Mexico, Germaine.
Well, thank you, Paul.
Yeah, well, we did talk on this show, so I made sure you are a return guest to Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'd have to go back into the Wayback Machine, though, because it's been uh, a few years, and we, of course, I believe at the outset, we're talking about either the soon-to-be passage of the Energy Transition Act or the aftermath of the Energy Transition Act. But in your own words, before we get too far down the path here in this conversation, kind of give us the high points of or the most salient points about the Energy Transition Act and your involvement with it.
Oh, thank you, Paul. So I became involved in the Energy Transition Act when I started working with the Four Corners area, City of Farmington, San Juan County, and Central Consolidated School District. My background as a lawyer has had, various permutations, but quite a bit of it was spent in the utility energy space and Native American law. And so actually the way I got involved in that was former Senator and Commissioner Lovejoy, and also, Commissioner of Public Regulation Commission Lovejoy, and then also PRC Commissioner Vicente Aguilar, became very concerned about what they were hearing about the closure of San Juan Generating Station potentially. And they asked me to meet with area legislators to talk through potential ways to keep the plant open and potentially have a glide path if closure did in fact occur, so that the economy in the area could rebound. And so that's how I became interested, obviously, in the Energy Transition Act from a professional standpoint, but also personally, having been in the utility energy space, concerned about moving into kind of the outcomes of Energy Transition Act too quickly before our communities can catch up and before the technology is actually ready to start. Paul, do you want me to kind of give an overview of the Energy Transition Act, or just kind of more high points?
Uh, well, I mean, what does it do? I obviously San Juan Generating Station shut down, but it has implications for many aspects of New Mexico and especially PNM's electricity generation. So, yeah, anything that's not too far into the weeds, but broadly speaking, what the Energy Transition Act was intended to do and how it's doing those things. A few points on that would be great.
I'm smiling because you're asking a lawyer not to go into the weeds. Um, but high level, essentially what the Energy Transition Act is attempting to accomplish is to be carbon free or carbon neutral within the next 40 to 50 years, high level. And Unfortunately, what that meant is that there was a provision in the Energy Transition Act that that I guess directly impacted San Juan Generating Station and potentially Four Corners Generating Station as well. Both of those energy industrial complexes are in the Four Corners area, and they employ quite a few of the local folks that families and communities depend on. So with respect to the Energy Transition Act, what it did was set up closure of plants in exchange for essentially a buyout by ratepayers of PNM's deferred maintenance and ownership on the San Juan Generating Station. And so it set up a situation where PNM was allowed to close that plant, San Juan Generating Station, approximately 30 years early. And in exchange for that, essentially ratepayers are now paying a mortgage for PNM's ability to do that with an extra amount on their bill each month. And there were some other provisions in the ETA that were meant to protect the community up in Four Corners from some of those hard impacts. For example, PNM was required to place at least or up to 400 megawatts of replacement capacity in the school district boundary of Central Consolidated School District. And other provisions have to do with making sure that the carbon, the CO2 output is diminished over time in New Mexico. That's just a high level, Paul, but essentially it's trying to make New Mexico go green on a time period, a time span.
Yeah. Now, one of the upshots of this entire situation, and we mentioned San Juan Generating Station, and I know at least currently one of your clients is in the Four Corners area that you're representing, but that station is not just about generating electricity from coal and all the impacts that has in terms of affordable, steady electricity, but also in the Four Corners, there are jobs, there are uh, tax dollars that are at stake or were at stake with the passage of the Energy Transition Act. Uh, where is that whole situation at this point? And if you want to talk about your clients specifically, that'd be great.
Thank you, Paul. So the client that you're referring to is Central Consolidated School District. Um, I often refer to them as being kind of at ground zero in terms of impact with respect to the closure of San Juan Generating Station. And let me just describe the reason for that. Central Consolidated is located primarily on the Navajo Reservation, which means that the school district has less than 2% taxable property. As we all know in New Mexico, schools are funded in two mechanisms, one through general funds that come for operational expenses, and then second, primarily relies on the ability of school districts to generate property taxes. And so for school districts that are on primarily federal enclaves like military bases or um, reservations, the ability of those school districts to raise funds for facilities and other capital expenses is very challenging. And so with respect to San Juan Generating Station and Four Corners Power Plant together, that actually comprised 80% of CCSD's taxable property base. And so about half of that is now gone with the closure of San Juan Generating Station. And as you said, rightfully so, Paul, we're not just talking about tax revenue generation base, but we're also talking about people and families and communities. And so the job loss up in that area has been extremely hard hitting. For example, in the year after San Juan Generating Station closed, Central Consolidated saw about a 700% increase in student homelessness within that first year. And we are addressing those issues as best we can in the school district, but those impacts are extremely challenging to deal with and hard hitting on families.
Yeah. So what you're saying essentially is that the Central Consolidated School District, and if you wouldn't mind talking briefly about the kind of the demographics and some of the specific challenges that they face, but that district essentially, if I'm not misunderstanding you, by the shuttering of that plant and dramatic scaling back of activity at the coal mine that fed that plant, that Central Consolidated School District saw their tax revenue drop by about 60%. Their uh, property taxes paid by the local governments, not formula money coming out of Santa Fe. Is that an accurate statement?
Yes, the only thing I would change, Paul, is that the it's not necessarily just from local government, right? But it's from those taxpayers, those industrial taxpayers that generate those revenues. And so um, when those taxpayers no longer exist, it's very difficult to replace those funds. So we worked very hard in the Energy Transition Act negotiations to make sure that CCSD would actually be able to kind of mitigate some of those property tax dollar losses. And that's why the provision was placed in the Energy Transition Act that required PNM to put it at up to 400 megawatts of replacement power within CCSD's district. And the reason for that, Paul, is that what we were trying to do was to at least try to mitigate, smooth out that huge property tax hit. Unfortunately, that has not materialized in full. And so the district is very concerned about that and looking to remedy that through the PRC and other avenues. Um, and Paul, can you just remind me a little bit of where else you wanted me to head in that
The
question?
demographics, unique aspects of Central Consolidated School District. It's
Thank you.
heavily Navajo, right?
Yes, so our student base is at least 95% Navajo. And so over the last few years, especially with the outcome of the Yazzie Martinez case, our school district has been focusing quite a bit on the importance of culture and language in the educational uh, outcomes and success for our students. And when we talk about this, Paul, it's really hard, I think, for folks who don't live up here to understand the demographics our children face. And these are COVID numbers, so unfortunately, they're actually probably a little bit worse now coming out of COVID. But we believe, and then the statistics show that about a third of our students do not have running water in their homes, plumbing, electricity, or access to internet. In the more remote areas, we believe that's as high as 70% or more. And so when you think about what these kiddos come to school with and the obstacles they come to school with, um, they are already kind of starting in a very challenging place. And as adults, looking to help their outcomes and their opportunities, it's really our job to find as many ways we possibly can to bolster their success and their opportunities and bridge those gaps. And so when we have a closure like San Juan Generating Station, where about half of our property tax revenues are now gone, we really need to find ways to obviously rebound and help create more economic opportunity in that region.
Now, one of the components of the Energy Transition Act was supposed to be some effort to bring some of that replacement electricity generation to the Four Corners and specifically, I believe, Central Consolidated School District, but that has not materialized. Now, even in the best case scenario, and if you have details, I would love to have them, but even in the best case scenario, the amount of tax dollars that would be brought into the district from deployment of solar panels or wind turbines or what have you would not be anywhere near what the coal plant paid in terms of taxes and created in terms of jobs. But it would have been something. But even that hasn't happened. Can you provide some details on what those agreements were supposed to be and what's happened since?
Absolutely, Paul. Thank you. So um, the agreement or the order actually coming out of the PRC, PNM agreed and the PRC ordered that PNM would provide pretty darn close to that 400 megawatt level of replacement within CCSD's taxable boundaries. Unfortunately, one of those projects was not able to come up into completion, and they ultimately, I think, breached that contract. I think that was the Rockmont project. And unfortunately, what's happened, Paul, is that instead of finding another um, replacement project within CCSD's boundary, PNM has moved on and placed replacement resources actually in the Farmington School District. So I don't want to take away, obviously, from the Four Corners area and what's happening in the Farmington district. But the fact remains that the ETA requires those replacement resources to be in CCSD's taxable boundary, and that has not occurred. Now, I want to just pause for a minute. We're talking a lot about tax revenue and the importance of that. But we also need to really talk about the job loss. And so, as you astutely said, Paul, having the replacement resources in CCSD's taxable boundaries is important, but so are the jobs. And as we all know, solar panel projects, if you're lucky, at once they're constructed, have maybe 2 to 5 jobs per project, and most of those jobs are not local. So in the Four Corners area, something I think a lot of folks may not understand or appreciate is that within the Navajo culture, a worker is not just essentially supporting his direct family, his nuclear family. He or she is also supporting an extended family. So when we talk about the hit for job loss, it's not to a nuclear family of 2 to 6 or however many people. It's much more than that. It's more like 15 to 20 folks who are impacted by the loss of that wage. And that's not to mention the impact of the loss of students in the school district or the loss of parents and students left behind as a result of that closure. Essentially, Paul, what it does is it takes an already very challenging situation and makes it much worse. And in this context, I like to talk about disproportionate impact. So, for example, this wasn't just one closure in the Four Corners area. I think in recent years, there's been about 5 closures of similar size, and there are slated to be, I think, up to 10 more. And so if you think about,
Power plants? Power plants?
yes, power plants and mines, I've got a map I can show you, Paul. It literally, I call it the Ring of Fire because it literally has industrial complexes kind of surrounding exterior and interior boundary of Navajo Nation. Some of those are in Arizona and those have already shut down. But I
I
definitely
see.
email that to you, Paul. It's a very good visual. So
Well, I
if you
can
think,
definitely include it
yes,
in the information we share, but uh, with the show notes. I want to follow up on that though, because I know one of those plants was what outside of Grants, I believe, a coal plant right off the freeway there, right?
that's correct.
Okay, and then Four Corners is another major power plant. I don't know, similar size to San Juan Generating Station, and that one is on the chopping block as well, right?
That's correct.
And that one's based in is that on Navajo land in the
Yes,
Four
that
Corners? Okay.
that is located on Navajo.
Now,
Yes.
I don't want to put you out of your element, but is that something that you're familiar with? To an extent, just kind of what's happening at Four Corners Power Plant.
Well, from a local perspective and from a CCSD perspective, um, the board has definitely indicated their support keeping that plant open. Um, Obviously,
The board
uh,
of.
I'm sorry, of Central Consolidated School District.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Yeah,
Fair
and
enough.
I'm
Yeah.
not here obviously to speak for them, but working with them, it is an extremely important industrial complex to keep open. So I know that folks are looking at carbon capture to try and keep that open and potentially other mechanisms. Um, from a tax standpoint, my understanding is PNM plans to assign their interest to Intech, which is a Navajo owned company. And so because of that, it won't be a state partner anymore or actor anymore. And so CCSD will take a pretty big hit on that property tax loss. But what CCSD is, very interested in is maintaining that job base for families and students.
Now, couple quick things on that, because that would be a huge 1-2 punch for in the span of a decade or so, to have both those power plants go away. But uh, my understanding is that Four Corners power plant is uh, is co-owned, or P&M owns part of it. Arizona Public Service, as I jokingly call them, the other APS. Of course, here in Albuquerque, APS is the school district. APS is also the name of the Arizona Power, main utility over there in Arizona. Um, and then the Navajo, this company you're talking about, Intech, Navajo owned, kind of within the Navajo Nation, and that they're very interested in taking over that facility. Now, uh, maybe, so does that all check out? Is that basically as you understand the situation as well?
Sure, absolutely. I don't want to speak on behalf of Intech, but my understanding is that they are looking at that potential. Um, Four Corners is a pretty huge operational input to the Navajo Nation budget, so I could understand why that would be something they'd want to keep open.
Absolutely. So I guess the last component of that is, understanding that here we are in New Mexico with this Energy Transition Act, which is forcing so-called renewables onto the grid in ever greater numbers, to the point where we're supposed to be 100% renewable. Uh, that facility, Four Corners, how does that fit in to New Mexico? Are they just going to have to sell their power to Arizona? Are they going to give us your best understanding of what their intentions would be with that plant moving forward, given that New Mexico is supposed to be moving away from any carbon-based fossil fuels?
My recollection on the Energy Transition Act, I don't, so I'm just thinking through your question, Paul. I don't recall any restrictions on New Mexico utilizing off the grid energy from coal-fired plants. I know California might have some of those restrictions, but I do not believe New Mexico's ETA does. Um, I think what we're going to see in the coming years as states start moving, closer toward those targets, and our technology hasn't really caught up yet in terms of battery storage or ways to keep renewable electricity going around the clock. I think we're going to find the need for coal-fired plants to really meet out, balance out those huge fluctuations in energy on the grid from renewables coming online and renewables coming offline. We haven't solved those problems yet, Paul. And so my prediction, similar to what happened in Germany and other places in Europe, is we're going to find ourselves needing that base power, that capacity, and consistent, constant readiness of that power. So my gut says that if we keep Four Corners Power Plant open, it will definitely be a pivotal part in our energy economy.
All right. Well, thank you for that explanation, because uh, there's no question the environmentalists are after that one as well. And of course, that would have a devastating impact on top of the already closed San Juan Generating Station and the loss of that. Now, uh, again, maybe you know about this, maybe not. There was a carbon capture and sequestration attempt at San Juan Generating Station. So the concept would have been to capture I don't know, 90-ish% of the CO2 generated in producing electricity from coal up there at San Juan, and then use the CO2 for oil and gas production, and essentially burying it underground. Any chance of that kind of thing happening at Four Corners? I'm not asking for blueprints or a specific proposal or plan, but you know, what are the chances of that kind of thing happening? Does it matter if the Navajo own it because they kind of can operate under a tribal situation where maybe they don't have the same rules and regulations? What's your take on that situation?
Great question, Paul. And there's a lot of questions in that question. So I'm going to
Sorry,
try,
yeah,
okay, I'm going to try to remember all of them. So I think the first thing I want to comment on that, and just a slight clarification, is that San Juan Generating Station, the carbon capture technology would have actually captured about 99% of the CO2 coming out. And I only say that, Paul, because I just want to, it's something that's important to me when we're talking about renewables right now being backed up essentially by natural gas. And just kind of, I want to make this kind of clarifying statement before I move on. I absolutely believe that a healthy mix of renewables is good for us. Um, but to say that we are ready and it's even possible for us to completely move off of hydrocarbons to what we're calling renewables, it, to me, is just not feasible or practical. And I know this isn't the podcast necessarily for that, but at some point I'd love to have that conversation, Paul, about are these really renewables and are they really kind of carbon neutral and have, an extremely small footprint? My take on that is no, they aren't. Um, Going back to your question, we'll call it a compound question. Um,
sure.
so I want to say that one of the most kind of sad things for me, and I really do mean that word, tragic, maybe even in terms of the closure of San Juan Generating Station, is that in about 2016, 2017, PNM had just gone through a very expensive retrofit that employed the state of the art scrubbing mechanisms for that plant. And so at closure, or at this precipice where maybe we were able to save that plant using carbon capture technology, it would have been one of the cleanest plants in the country from that perspective. And so, from my standpoint, in closing that plant for that community, it just doesn't make sense because the benefit of closure from an output standpoint versus the impact to community, to kids, to elders, to jobs, it does not balance. And so um, moving over to the Four Corners plant, I believe and I don't believe, but it is a fact that there have been some great looks into that plant and the geology near and under it to determine whether or not it would be a carbon capture friendly site. And my understanding is that it is, Paul, from um, a number of scientific studies being conducted out there.
All right, well, that's good to know. So we're kind of trucking along here, and we have a few minutes to go. So I want to revisit the litigation that you're involved with on behalf of the Central Consolidated School District. Uh, what remedies are you looking for? You know, if they're not going to build these so-called renewable plants in that area, and that's in that district, there's got to be, I would expect, we're talking 60% of their budget for this one school district. That seems like something that obviously the state is awash in money right now from the oil and gas industry, but we're still talking about a lot of money, and unless they're kind of forced to by the courts, I can't imagine the legislature and this governor are going to be interested in writing annual checks to Central Consolidated School District for the kind of money that would be required to replace this power plant. What are you looking for? What are they looking for? And where's this whole situation at now in terms of the legal wrangling?
I appreciate that question, Paul. It's a hitting the nail on the head question. Um, I'm not going to probably tell you publicly what my legal strategy is right now.
Come on.
I know, I know. I do have a couple thoughts on how to enforce the ETA, and we will be pursuing those things. Um, and so I do apologize. I know we
That's
talked
okay. By enforcing
about
the
it
ETA, you're
earlier.
talking about the
Yeah.
getting the location of some of those so-called renewable facilities to go into that area. That's what you're talking about.
Yes, and in addition to that, the both unanticipated consequences and the disproportionate impact that the ETA has caused that area. And so, from a contextual standpoint, what I'd like to point out is that the Four Corners area and many rural and remote areas of our state literally hold our state up in terms of revenues, food sources, water, quite frankly, energy. And what I'd like to really have folks focus on who live in more urban areas is to remember that those areas, San Juan Generating Station, Four Corners, have provided our state with electricity at very economical costs for let's see, so it's in the 60s, 70s, so for 50 years, right? Those folks have provided that energy, again, like I said, at low cost. And I feel like as a state, we owe it to them to give them a glide path, a transition, a way to adapt to what's occurring. And so I guess my ask um, would be that we find a way as legislators, as officials, as the public in general, to remember the sacrifice, frankly, that these communities are now experiencing because we've decided politically to go another route. And so, for that, Paul, I would really challenge legislators to think of ways to um, actually come through with the promises that were made in the ETA, and more, because this district is literally dealing with historic inadequate funding that we need to resolve.
Yeah. Uh, and just to be clear, what kinds of facilities are we talking about? When you think about the replacements they're wanting, wind and solar, it would seem that solar is more likely. Is wind viable in the Four Corners? I've yet to see a windmill anywhere up near Farmington, and I travel there pretty regularly. I'm not saying they couldn't. I just don't see them nearly as often as I see them when I drive to, say, Roswell and the southeast part of the state.
Well, you're absolutely right, Paul. And the studies show that the wind corridors are in the eastern part of our state. They are not in the northwest. So, really, the only viable option is solar panels. Now, I don't know how many of you know what a NEPA lawyer is, but that's the National Energy Policy Act. And so, what NEPA does is anytime you're engaged in a federal project, um, you look at the hard impacts of various projects. Unfortunately, what I'm seeing with respect to these wind and solar projects, we're not taking a hard look on the other environmental impacts or the social justice impacts that are occurring with those. And I'm very disappointed by that, because we owe it to our communities and to our fragile ecosystems up in the Four Corners area to really study those hard impacts.
All right. Well, anything else you want to share about this particular? Is this in federal court or state court? And where are we in the process here?
So I think it'll be a mix potentially. Um, we're looking at most likely an action in the Public Regulation Commission, potentially moving forward on an action in the Supreme Court. And then from there, looking at other possibilities. The federal government does have a trust responsibility to Navajo kiddos, and in addition to that, I think it's important to look at these disproportionate impacts I used to be an urban person. I used to live in Santa Fe. Absolutely fell in love with Farmington and the Four Corners area. And so I guess what I'd want to say to close up, Paul, is that we owe it to the rural and remote areas of our state to understand what their needs are because they literally shore up so much from an economic standpoint for the rest of us in our state. And so, from my standpoint, I kind of just want to remind folks not to forget um, that that benefit that they provide the rest of the state.
All right. Well, I appreciate your time, Germaine. Any information you might want to share? What's the name of the case? I guess would be a good starting point because uh, I think that's a good way for people to track it if they
One
want
is
to
a
find.
potential appeal of a PRC decision, Paul. The other potentially would be a show cause order and an enforcement action on the ETA.
Okay. And can people engage with the PRC? I know it's a new uh, type of body under the constitutional amendment. The governor names the three people, and they're not elected like they used to be. So I totally understand if that's not a fruitful avenue for people to engage, but I definitely want to have you on to talk about it in the future. So
That'd
uh,
be great, Paul.
you, yeah, good old PRC, always something exciting with those folks. So thank you very much for your time, Germaine, and we will talk to you again soon. So thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.